I do love to be beside the seaside. I love this lolly-licking atmosphere. And I love the architecture of the seaside as well. Not just the great coastal castles and the churches and things, but the ordinary buildings too. The boarding houses, the fun fairs, the beach huts, the ice cream stalls, the buildings that we use. In fact, that's what these 10 programmes are going to be all about. The buildings that people have constructed over the centuries to help themselves work and live and enjoy themselves. And I'm starting here at the seaside because I love it. But on the other hand, we love this beautiful, unspoilt and tranquil atmosphere too. Though to be honest, I'm not quite sure why we do, because it isn't all that comfortable. The sand gets in your sandwiches, and the water's bitterly cold. You set off from home, and by the time you get here, it's started to rain, or the fog's rolled in, or there's a brisk and a biting breeze. So why do we come? When did we start coming? Have people always enjoyed it? What did our ancestors think of the seaside? Well, Holy Island is a good place to ask those questions, because actually we know a lot about a group of people who made a conscious decision to come and live here, beside the seaside. They were monks, and they walked across these dangerous sands between shifting beds of quicksand in the year 635 AD to found a monastery. Its successor still stands, a glorious 12th century ruin of round Norman arches and weathered red sandstone. Next door to it is the parish church of St Mary, which is a clear reminder of the ancient monastery where from the start they built two churches facing each other. But the original monastery was small and rough. The monks lived in small round huts. It must have been basic, bleak even for much of the year. So why didn't they choose somewhere sheltered and warm, without fogs and sea breezes? Well, firstly they wanted to be near the King of Northumbria, King Oswald, who lived at Bamburgh a few miles south of here. He'd given them the island, so it would have been churlish to go somewhere else. The main reason that they came to live beside the seaside was that they weren't looking for an easy life. In fact, they were looking for as hard a life as possible. They came here especially because it was wild and dangerous, not because it was beautiful. They thought that this coast was the haunt of the devil, and they came here to fight him. The most famous of those early monks was Cuthbert, Saint Cuthbert as he became, and for part of his life he abandoned the monastery and went to live as a hermit on the Farne Islands, off the coast, a few miles south of Holy Island. The Venerable Bede wrote that no one before Cuthbert had been able to live alone on this island without trouble, because it was haunted by evil spirits. But when the soldier of Christ entered there, armed with the helmet of salvation, the wicked foe himself was driven far away. He was a tough lad, Cuthbert. He had to be. There's another story about him, which is very revealing about what the seaside meant to the monks and to Cuthbert. Apparently he used to sneak off in the middle of the night, and the other monks got a bit suspicious, so they followed him. And they found that what he was doing was wading out into the North Sea and standing there all night up to his neck, right up to his neck in the North Sea. What he was doing was testing himself, trying to prevent himself from having naughty thoughts, mortifying his flesh. And I can tell you there are few things in the world better at mortifying the flesh than a dip in the North Sea. Bits of me are being mortified even at this very moment. And I come out now. Oh dear. Oh. Oh. What did you expect? Anyway, when Cuthbert came out of the sea, apparently 2 sea otters bounded up to him and warmed him with their breath and rubbed him with their fur. I'm not entirely certain that it's considered desirable or even legal nowadays to allow animals to rub you with their fur, but that sort of story does suggest that Cuthbert and the other monks liked nature, and that while they feared the horrors of this coast, they were also aware of its beauty. Later generations of monks after the Norman conquest rebuilt gloriously and turned their houses into powerful super monasteries, super buildings. This happened at Lindisfarne in the 12th century. At Hartlepool, the parish church of St Hilda is a survival of the monastery which was rebuilt in the 13th century. And at Whitby, St Hilda's own monastery was also gloriously rebuilt in the 13th century. The same thing happened here at Tynemouth too, on yet another bleak, exposed headland on the northeast coast. This is one of those super buildings. The monks who built Tynemouth came here because it was the site of an early monastery and the grave of an early saint called St Oswin. It was begun, well, this part was begun in about 1190 in a variation of the Gothic style, known as the Early English style. It's an absolutely magnificent example of the style. 3 tiers of long, thin, elegant lancet windows, richly decorated with shafts on the inside. Both of those are features which are typical of the years around 1200. And so is this decoration, the dogtooth ornament, which is to be found all over early English churches. The monks who built Tynemouth came from the south of England, from St Albans in fact, and one of them wrote a letter home to his mates, or to his brothers, which is the first really bad tourist press that the northeast ever got. This is what he wrote. Our house is surrounded on all sides but one by the sea. Day and night the waves break and roar against the cliffs. Thick sea frets roll in, wrapping everything in gloom, so that dim eyes and hoarse voices and sore throats are the consequence. The north wind is always blowing, bringing with it cold and snow and storms. And in the spring, the sea air blights the blossom on the few stunted fruit trees, so that you think you'll be lucky to find one wizened apple. See to it, dear brother, that you never come to so comfortless a place. So, for most of our history, it's clear that the seaside wasn't a place to come to for pleasure. It was a comfortless place, to be avoided if at all possible, a place to be frightened of. In fact, it took us longer to learn to love the seaside than almost any other part of our surroundings. During the 18th century, the English began to rediscover nature. Rural beauty came to be admired, rugged mountains were admired, but the sea remained a place to avoid, too rough to handle. Here's an example. Seaton Delaval Hall was built by the architect Sir John Bamburgh, who, like the Tynemouth monk, was another southerner, but he claimed to prefer the north to what he called the tame, sneaking south. I've always liked him for that. This is one of the most romantic houses in England. The architecture is wild and restless. Towers, deep carvings, bulgy bits. The architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner described it as an architecture for the storm and the driving cloud, for sombre ships and the battering sea. You'd think it was made for a wild seacoast. But in fact, even though the beach is just a mile over there towards the horizon, the house doesn't even face the sea. Its owners ignored the sea. They just didn't want to know, because as late as this, by the early 18th century, there were very few people ready to actually enjoy the seaside or to visit it for pleasure. Things Things were beginning to change though, and the place they started to change, not just for the northeast, but for the whole of Britain, strangely enough, was Scarborough. In 1626, a woman called Mrs. Farrow noticed a spring of red-stained water oozing out of the cliffs. It probably looked a bit like this, revolting, but she recognised it as a mineral spring or spa, and pretty soon people of good quality were coming to take the waters. A few years later, a chap called Dr. Whitty bought the spa, and he had this really witty wheeze. He realised that the sea was next to his spring, and that seawater and spa water have got a number of things in common. They're both wet, unbelievably cold, and they both taste repulsive. So he started to advertise the sea as well as his spa.
Of course, at this stage, they didn't come here to enjoy the water. They came here because they thought it might do them good. And there's two things that you can do with seawater. You can bathe in it, and you can drink it. Now, seawater's got lots of the same chemicals in it as spa water, as mineral water. It just tastes vile and makes you go to the toilet. One 18th century quack said that a pint of seawater is commonly sufficient to provide 3 or 4 smart stools, which is something for me to look forward to, I suppose. But the sea bathing was done in the nude. I think that's a bit worked out.
Right through the 18th century, there was mixed nude bathing on the beaches of Britain. Nobody seems to have minded or felt particularly naughty about it, though there is a picture by Thomas Rowlandson of loads of chaps ogling naked women swimmers at Margate in about 1800.
There don't seem to be any pictures of naughty women ogling naked chaps, which gives one some hope. For a gentleman like myself, the sea is, I'm afraid, a source of some pain. However, one must visit the seaside in order to see and be seen by polite society. Scarborough here has become a place of resort for people of good quality. We have built ourselves elegant houses, light-hearted, with painted stucco, elaborate ironwork, and the delicate rhythm of repeated bay windows, in which there is nothing finer than to sit and watch a good proportion of the gay and fashionable strolling by.
This Regency Street up on the South Cliff, with its wonderful views down across the town, is called the Esplanade. Now, an esplanade is technically an open area around a fortification to allow a field of fire. One such area by the beach in Weymouth had been converted about 1786 into a strolling promenade, and from there the name and the idea was copied all over the world. That idea was for posh people to go for walks, to indulge in genteel holidays.
The lower orders never came here.
The lower orders never came anywhere near the seaside to play until the coming of the railways. Saltburn is a good example of what happened when the railways allowed the Victorian masses to discover the seaside. It had just been a hamlet of 16 houses, locked away on a remote coast.
This is the Victorian railway station that changed all that. It was designed in 1861 for the Stockton and Darlington Railway. It looks fancy, doesn't it? It had to be, because by mid-Victorian times people were flocking to the seaside in vast numbers. And what they expected when they got here was something jolly and entertaining and different from home.
Victorian and Edwardian architecture can be lively anywhere, but never more so than at the seaside. These terraces on the cliff at Saltburn still have the same features as the earlier Scarborough buildings, iron balconies and bay windows, but in the Victorian period the detail got bigger and bolder, more showy-offy. The former Zetland Hotel is an excellent example of high Victorian design, richly decorated and getting fancier and fancier the higher up the building that you get. The hotel even had its own private railway platform. But it's the seaside pleasure buildings that reveal the change of mood best. The pretty frothiness of the pier and its brightly painted pier end pavilion. And especially the utterly gorgeous funicular railway, or inclined tramway as it's properly described.
It was opened on the 28th of June 1884.
Thank you.
This is another typical side of the Victorians. The way they could combine engineering with prettiness so perfectly. Well, I can't think of a more entertaining way to climb a cliff than that.
Victorian seasides got fancier and fancier. There were fancy railings to lean on, fancy seats to sit on. Guest houses and hotels became curlier and curlier in a bid to suggest the huge chunks of fun that would be yours if you were to stay there. The ultimate was the extraordinary Grand Hotel in Scarborough. But ordinary buildings like bathing huts and beach huts were perhaps even more important in creating the mood of holiday. That whole delicious froth of buildings to provide a fantasy for the massed crowds who poured into these resorts 100 years ago. By the beginning of the 20th century, Whitley Bay on that Northumbrian coast which so frightened St Cuthbert and the monks had become hugely popular, and it still is. It's got big, broad beaches. But the centrepiece of the resort is a most interesting building. Not many people from Tyneside would fail to recognise the Spanish city, but not many people realise what a historic building it is. It was built in 1908 of reinforced concrete, ferro-concrete, and its dome might even be the very oldest reinforced concrete dome that there is. There are slightly older warehouses and whatnot, but this was revolutionary stuff for a fun-filled building, because it is, you know. It's filled with fun, frolics and fear.
St Cuthbert came to the northeast looking for devils, for evil spirits. Well, this is my evil spirit. It scares me to death. I'd rather wither me bits in the North Sea any day than go on this, but you know what producers are. Anything for sensation.
Now listen to the words that are coming through. I got attention just for you. Pull the phone, close the door, and I'll tell you things all overdue. Another day, another night, another reason. You'll find I sure do care. I like a dog on the lead. I'm gonna follow you everywhere. I will stay. I'm gonna.
We've come now about as far from that wild, isolated coast that so terrified our ancestors as it's possible to come. We've learned to love the seaside. We've turned it into a frenzied and exaggerated, fun-filled, I was going to say paradise, but to lots of people nowadays it's more like hell.
You know I'm stuck on you.
Because we've made another discovery in the last couple of 100 years. We've decided at last that as well as being fun, the seaside is beautiful in its own right. That its wild loneliness isn't frightening, but beautiful. In the mid-1800s, the Grey family of Earl Grey tea fame deliberately built this bathing house in the wildest place that they could find. They built it in the Tudor style, with splendidly fancy imitation Tudor chimney pots. But the sea and the sea winds have fought back, causing amazing, almost sculptural erosion to the stonework of the house.
Behind the house, there are a series of rock-cut steps. which lead down to a pool cut out of the solid rock, which to my mind just looks a little bit too frightening to actually swim in. They must have been daring chaps and chapesses, those Victorian greys.
But a house like this, in its wonderfully wild situation, proves that at last the British had discovered that they loved the seaside. Nothing like peace and solitude. And that, of course, brings its own little basket of problems. This is one of them. These huts on the foreshore between Newton and Embleton on the Northumbrian coast were built on land belonging to the local landowner, a man called Sir Ivan Sutherland, from the mid-20s. The first ones were probably built for friends of his who wanted to play golf on the local links. But since then, about 40 have been built, and they're all owned by different families. Some of the shacks have been in the same families since before the war.
They're not particularly historic or beautiful. Nobody's turned them into masterpieces of quaintness. They're just nice little wooden clapboard huts that provide an escape for their owners during the summer months. The question is whether they pollute the wild and natural grandeur of the wild landscape. They certainly wouldn't be allowed now. They're here because they date from before the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 came into operation.
They're on land leased from the National Trust, and broadly speaking, the National Trust is committed to maintaining landscape in as unspoilt a form as possible. It's done a wonderful job of conserving hundreds of miles of coastline, and the question for a while was whether they should remove all of these huts in order to make this glorious stretch of beach as unspoilt by man as it's possible to be. Recently, though, they've made the decision not to remove the huts. I'm delighted.
I like them. They're tastefully painted, unobtrusive, sweet and simple. No part of the British landscape has been left untouched by man, and these huts are part of a small but important social movement, the seaside hut movement, the escape from the city. In their way, I think that these huts are as much part of the social history of this landscape as the great coastal castles are.
But the problem remains. We've all learned to love to be beside the seaside. It took us 1,500 years to learn it, but by golly, we've learned it now. And the problem is how to keep it as beautiful as we want it to be, while at the same time letting us all enjoy it. Crowds are wonderful at places like Scarborough, where we've created vibrant townscapes of grand and humble buildings, fun buildings for a fun place. But the peaceful places should be peaceful. Sadly, they're not. This is St Cuthbert's holy island today. 40 years ago, if you came here, you had to leave your car on the mainland, and ancient taxis used to ferry you across the sand. Salted, rotted holes in the floor of the cars, and water used to spurt up your trouser legs. It used to be a spiritual experience to come here. Not anymore. Not anymore. When are we going to stop destroying the things that we've finally learned to love? It's a well-known truth that if you ask a cameraman to take pictures of fishing boats, he'll let you tickle his tummy. They love boats to cameramen.
And who can blame them, laddie? There's no sight more beautiful, no idea more romantic than the tall ship and the call of the running tide.
How true. In last week's programme, I looked at the delights of the seaside, the coast as a source of fun. I looked at the way we gradually learned not to be frightened of the sea, and the way we learned to love it.
Oh, but the sea has never been just a source of fun. One of the hymns that I used to love when I was a lad was that one about those in peril on the sea. And long before people ever came here for pleasure, the seaside was a place to live and a place to die. And the reason for living and dying in such inhospitable conditions as the seaside often provides is because the work was here. And that meant first and foremost fishing. Ah, the romance of the sea, the hauling in of the nets and the deck awash with the plash of salt water. Here on Lindisfarne, fortunately, you don't even have to get your feet wet to look at boats. Not that he's frightened of the water, of course, because a whole host of them very conveniently has been hauled up onto the beach, turned upside down, sliced into two, and made into some of the quaintest and queerest little huts to be found anywhere on the coast of Britain. I say little huts, but in fact, these were pretty big boats. They were masted and decked, 50 or 60 feet long, 10, 12, 15-man crew. These were the Lindisfarne herring fleet of the late 1800s, which fought a losing battle against the new steam-driven trawlers about the year 1900. And here they are.
What I love about them is how grungy they are. Nobody's tarted them up. They're all weathered and tatty, and they smell of tar and the sea. And they're surrounded by amazing piles of detritus, genuine maritime tat. They're still being used. Nobody's turned them into bijou tourist quainteries. These old boats are all sheds now, but there was a time when upturned boats were used as houses all up and down this coast. There were some on the beach at Blythe, for example.
Ah, it was a romantic existence, laddie. Cosy, well corked against the wind, snug with me little pot-bellied stove. Or in the summer, sitting on a cracket at me little wooden door, mending the nets, splicing the ropes, repairing the pots, yarning yarns. Aye, it was a good life. I wonder if it was. I wonder if it was. Are we being absurdly sentimental? Are we in danger of romanticising the past?
Take a village like Craster, for example.
As pretty a place as you'll find on the whole northeast coast, laddie. It's got kippers and, a nice village pub, pretty cottages, fine beach.
There is no real beach, actually, but there are fine walks along the foreshore, with Dunstanburgh, the ultimate coastal castle, beckoning gloriously in the distance. And more mundanely, there are toilets and a tourist centre and a car park, because these days its main industry is tourism. But it is worth remembering that places like Craster weren't built with tourists in mind. This exceptionally pretty harbour, for example, which must be the subject of 100,000 holiday photos, was built for the export of road chippings, which were quarried from the cliffs that surround the car park. Even the piers were built not of romantic old stone, but of workmanlike concrete. But even before that trade in roadstone was started, this was an industrial settlement of a sort, or at least a working place. It had its harbour and its fishing boats. It was selected not for picturesqueness, but for efficiency. Kippering sheds might fascinate tourists nowadays, but really they were just like diminutive factories for processing the raw material. They have no obvious charm except that wonderful, smoky, kippery smell, which you can't enjoy, of course. And even the cottages all around, which we all lust after nowadays as second homes, well, they were just the workers' housing. Craster also has a little modern council estate, which I suspect that most of the tourists who come here feel is a bit of a come down from the old cottages by the harbour. I think they look as if they've just been plonked on the landscape. One thing about the original fishing village by comparison is how cleverly designed it all is, how compact, how efficient, nestled around the one little cove on the coast. And the other thing is how pretty it is, how comfy, how right. It fits here. Unlike the mid-20th century housing up there, it fits into the contours of the landscape.
But as well as fitting into the landscape, fishermen's cottages are also built of the landscape. Vernacular buildings are almost always built of the materials that are found all around them, so cottages like these on Holy Island are completely unique to this place. Take the pan-tiled roofs, for example. These beautiful shaped, orange, weathered tiles are found only in a band really from the Scottish lowlands down to East Anglia. They were probably imported first of all as ballast on ships from the Low Countries, but they've been made here since at least the early 1600s. So if you see a cottage with a pan-tiled roof, you can be pretty well sure that you're on or near the east coast. But the walls are even more of a geographical giveaway. Now, Northumberland is a sandstone county. Nearly all of its historic buildings are built of sandstone, usually of a sort of buffish colour. Nice variations there. But up here in the northeast of the county, there's a band of sandstone that's been stained pink by chemicals, usually hematite, and that can produce delicious variations in colour, from sort of almost dark red to the most delicate shades of pink. And then there's whinstone. Now, this black stone is whinstone or dolerite, which is a volcanic rock. And there's a great band of it across Northumberland. It was forced up through cracks in the much older sandstone, and it forms the dramatic cliffs that the Roman wall is built on, or the great coastal castles, Dunstanburgh and Bamburgh, and here at Lindisfarne. So, when you see a cottage like this, which has got pantiles, black whinstone, pinkish sandstone, it couldn't be anywhere else but up the northeast coast. Here's a little regional oddity. It's on the beach south of Berwick. It's called Chiswick Shield. Now, a shield or shieling is a seasonal or a summer dwelling, usually for farmers taking their herds up to the mountain pastures or shieling grounds. But there were lots of fishing shields as well, for the summer fishing season. North shields and south shields are the best known examples. But what makes Chiswick Shield unusual is that it's still been put to its original use by fishermen who come down here for the salmon season. Just a one-room cottage amid the dunes with the wild, wild sea. Ah, the wild, wild sea. This sceptred isle, Oh, shut up. The cottages are tempting, but the bit I'm not so sure about with the fisherman's life is actually going out to sea.
There are too many gravestones like this to remind me of the reality of the seaman's life, the cruelty, the harshness, the uncertainty. This northeast coast in past centuries was one of the busiest shipping lanes around the coast of Britain, and it was extremely dangerous. There was one dreadful 18th century storm when 27 ships were destroyed in a single night. So you've decided to abandon the sailor's life now that you've seen it isn't perhaps as romantic as you thought? Well, just hang on a minute, for I have a heartwarming tale to unfold. It's a tale full of danger. But it's the story of how the Northeast has played such an extraordinarily big part in the history of safety at sea. Yes, the Northeast has played a big part in the history of safety at sea. First of all, the world's first proper lifeboat was designed at South Shields in 1790 in order to help sailors at the terrifying mouth of the Tyne. It's no longer used, of course, but it's still by the sea at South Shields, very prettily displayed in its own lifeboat house of delicate Victorian cast iron. But of all the lifeboat stories of the Northeast, it is, of course, little Grace here in the churchyard at Bamburgh, who's the name that everybody knows, sleeping peacefully in her little bed of stone. Grace Darling was born opposite the church in one of those typical sandstone and whinstone cottages, and she died 27 years later, a few yards away by the village green, in another slightly grander cottage. But the thing she's remembered for happened out there on a dreadful night in 1838, when she rowed in an open boat with her father across a mile of mountainous seas to rescue the survivors of the steamer the Forfarshire, out there
in the Farne Islands.
And she pulled away on the rolling sea, over the water blue, and perhaps she could hear the cry of the shipwrecked crew. But Grace had an English heart, the raging storm she braved. She pulled away mid the dashing spray and the blue. She said,
By, that's stirring stuff. OK, so everybody knows about Grace Darling, but there's another, much less well-known and much earlier maritime safety story to come out of Bamburgh. When it came to the end of its useful castle-y life, Bamburgh Castle was run in the 18th century as a charitable trust by a remarkable chap called Dr. Sharp. Through the windows behind him in this painting, you can see a stricken ship.
Dr. Sharp was horrified at the suffering of sailors shipwrecked on this frightening and exposed coast, and he introduced his own pioneering safety precautions. These massive chains were used to haul to safety vessels shipwrecked on the nearby rocks.
And he provided a hospital and lodgings in the castle keep, where shipwrecked sailors could stay free of charge.
He even had a lifeboat made in 1785, which, to be honest, predated the South Shields one. It probably wasn't as good, though, because it was designed by a southerner, a London coach builder called Lionel Lukin.
That's where Grace was living when she did her daring deeds, in the Longstone Lighthouse. Aren't lighthouses fantastic? Such romance, such drama, such architectural variety as well. This one at Whitby is a giant Greek Doric column. They're functional buildings, but they still manage to seem cosy enough to live in. In fact, since they all became automatic, the authorities have been flooded with requests from people like my romantic maritime mate wanting to live in them. Not that you'd live in the tower itself. You would have done in those lights built on tiny remote rocks, but on nice roomy islands like St Mary's Island off Whitley Bay, you've got a nice roomy cottage to live in.
I know that, laddie. I'm not a fool, you know. St Mary's was built in 1897, and as it's 126 feet high, it's a very long way to the top. It's 137 steps to the top, in fact. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11. It's built of 750,000 bricks. It seems like more. Now we are approaching the ultimate Grundy fantasy. 125, 26, 27, 29, 30, 31, 32, 34, 6, 37. I've been passionate about lights since I was a little boy. I used to love torches, especially those ones you could make go red and green as well. I was born just after the war, so I narrowly missed out on searchlights. And the famous 5 and the secret 7 were always having spiffing adventures in lighthouses, but I never even went inside one. So this is the first time I've ever seen a lighthouse light. Isn't that superb? The gleam, the power. It had a range of 17 miles. Now that is a mega torch. Now this is the romance of the sea. I said, this is the romance of the sea.
I think I'll just stay down here, laddie.
He's frightened of heights.
There have been lighthouses around Britain almost as long as there have been ships. In fact, a Roman lighthouse survives in the grounds of Dover Castle.
But since 1536, the vast majority of them have been built by an organisation called Trinity House. And if you're really looking for somewhere special to live, well, They've got 3 houses, in London, in Hull, and here in Newcastle, in a location which is really the ultimate sneaky uppies. The Newcastle house has been here since at least 1505, and almost 500 years of continuous occupation and remodelling have produced a warren of architectural delights. Not just sneakies uppies, but divies underies as well.
Some of it shows its ancient origins with its medieval stonework and fantastically steep roof. But the bulk of what one sees on the outside is 18th century, Georgian. Each range is carefully dated and each facade a different pattern of sash windows, often like here with nicely pedimented doorways. The hall has a gorgeous date stone of 1721 and its windows are typical of that date. Sash windows again, but with elliptically arched heads. Next to it, the entrance to the chapel was rebuilt in 1800. But inside, the chapel is beautifully 17th century. Well, actually, the ceiling and the windows are probably older, 16th century, but the pews and the pulpit are typically Jacobean. Perfect. Inside the hall, we're back in the early Georgian period again. It's got a rather rough but jolly plaster ceiling. And the panelling on the walls with its bold moulding and the deep shiny patina is just what you'd expect in 1721.
Don't you think this is the most amazing thing to find stuffed up back lanes?
To the mouth of the Tyne for yet another northeast life-saving first. Set up to rescue sailors wrecked on the notorious Black Midden rocks below, the Tynemouth Volunteer Life Brigade was the first brigade of its type in the world, and this is its watch house. It was built in 1886 by a chap with a good Geordie name, C.T. Gomachinsky, the borough engineer, and it's always seemed to me to be the perfect essence of what a seaside building should look like. Painted and pretty, weatherboarded, as if it was a rowing boat. Big bay windows where you could sit like a retired Captain Haddock with a telescope, shivering your timbers, dreaming of the sea. And splice me mainbrace, there he is. While below you the surf pounds away at the harbour piers.
But of all the working buildings by the seaside, it's these piers that amaze me most. These are the most heroically architectural of all of the measures taken to protect those in peril on the sea. Safe havens. They're so bold, so heroic in their design. Great sweeping curves, the scale of them, the cyclopean grandeur of their stonework. But the question that amazes me most of all is quite simply, how on earth did they build them? Oh, it was with difficulty. It took 54 years from beginning to end, from 1853 to 1907. It was almost a lifetime. So how did they do it? Well, the easy part was dumping millions and millions of tons of rubble from side and bottom door barges to form mounds on the seabed. But the hard part was sending men down to level out the mounds so that the walls of the piers could be built upon them. Aye, it was a hard life, a diver's life. Divers? I thought you said this was the 1850s.
Oh, there were helmet divers and there were pairs of men in diving bells. It wasn't easy to find men to go down in the helmets because they didn't like it at all. They found it lonely, but it wasn't so bad with the diving bells because they went down in twos and they were very well paid. They received 1 shilling and 5 extra to compensate for the danger, and they were built of sandstone, is that right?
limestone for the base here, and sandstone up top, and granite where there were steps and things like that. But the really interesting and innovative part was that from 1863 onwards, there was concrete blocks, 42-ton concrete blocks made here at the pier end, was used for the core of the pier, transported along there on gigantic cranes. But 54 years to complete. The mighty forces of nature, laddie. Time and again they swept asunder the works of man and made him start again. This is getting silly.
These piers, and others like them, Sunderland's another example, are among the great achievements of the Victorian age. It would take an hour to tell you about all the problems they had to overcome. For example, you can see from these exposed foundations that they were forced to change direction halfway through. They built the North Pier curved like the South Pier, but the seas washed it all away and they had to start again and build it straight. Until these piers were built, there was only 6 feet of water over the Tyne bar at low tide. There were even times when you could walk across. And sometimes loaded ships were stuck in the river for 2 or 3 months until the tides were right. The building of these piers provided a channel that allowed the Tyne to prosper, allowed the big ships in and out.
It's a long way to the end of the pier. It feels like almost halfway to Norway. A whole lot of sea out there, a lot of land back there. And where the two meet has always seemed to me to be the most fascinating of landscapes. Fascinating, but endlessly perilous.